When I moved to Ayutthaya for work, I didn't expect much excitement. The city was quieter than Bangkok, with ancient ruins and slow-moving rivers. My new job as a museum researcher had me poring over old records and artifacts every day. It wasn't thrilling, but it paid the bills. The first few weeks passed uneventfully. Commutes, coffee breaks, the humdrum of office life. Then, one afternoon, my boss handed me an unusual assignment. "There's an old temple on the outskirts," she said, sliding a faded folder across her desk. "Wat Prang Noi. It's been abandoned for decades, but there's talk of restoring it. The local council wants us to catalog anything historically significant before they start renovations." I'd heard of Wat Prang Noi in passing. Locals whispered about it being cursed, haunted by the ghost of a bride who killed herself on her wedding day. Supposedly, she still wandered the grounds, looking for her groom, or worse, a replacement. It sounded like nonsense, but the folder included approval forms, so I couldn't exactly say no. The next morning, I drove out to the site. The temple was hidden behind a thick grove of trees, barely visible from the road. The path leading to it was overgrown, the air heavy with the scent of frangipani. When I stepped out of my car, the silence hit me. No birds, no insects, just the crunch of gravel under my shoes. The temple itself was in worse shape than I'd imagined. The stupa was cracked and leaning, and the wooden beams of the main hall had rotted away, leaving only a skeletal frame. It felt like the whole place was holding its breath, waiting for something or someone. I unpacked my tools and got to work. Most of it was routine, taking photos, sketching diagrams, jotting down notes. But as the hours passed, I started to feel watched. At first, it was just a vague unease, like someone was standing just out of sight. I told myself it was my imagination, a byproduct of the eerie surroundings. But then I started hearing things, a soft rustling in the trees, a faint sound, like fabric brushing against stone, and then a whisper, "Why are you here?" I froze. The voice was low, almost too soft to hear, but it was close, far too close. My throat tightened, and I turned around, scanning the ruins. No one. The sun was dipping lower, casting long shadows across the temple grounds. I shook off the nerves and tried to focus. I told myself it was just the wind, playing tricks on me. But then I saw her. She was standing near the stupa, half hidden behind a tree. Her white dress was torn and dirty, and her long black hair hung limp over her shoulders. She wasn't looking at me. She was staring at the ground, her hands clutching something small and red. "Excuse me," I called out, my voice shaking slightly. "This site is closed to visitors. You shouldn't be here." She didn't respond. I stepped closer, my heart pounding. "Miss, are you?" Before I could finish, she lifted her head. Her face was pale, streaked with what looked like dirt or blood. Her eyes were sunken and hollow, but what caught my attention was her mouth. It was stretched into an impossibly wide grin, her teeth jagged and uneven, like shards of broken pottery. The object in her hands, a red garland of wedding flowers, fell to the ground as she took a step toward me. "You came back for me?" she asked, her voice suddenly sharp and demanding. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my notebook. "You came back for me?" she hissed, her grin widening. I don't know," I stammered. She moved faster than I thought possible, closing the distance between us in an instant. Her hands shot out, cold and impossibly strong, grabbing my wrist. The smell of decay hit me like a wave, and I realized with horror that her dress wasn't just dirty. It was soaked in blood. "You're lying," she whispered, leaning in so close I could feel her breath. "You're just like him." I didn't know what she meant, but I didn't have time to ask. With a strength that didn't match her frail frame, she shoved me backward. I tripped over a loose stone and hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of my lungs. When I looked up, she was gone. I scrambled to my feet, clutching my wrist where her icy grip still lingered. My tools and papers were scattered, but I didn't care. I grabbed my bag and ran. As I reached my car, I glanced back one last time. She was standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. Her grin had vanished, replaced by an expression of cold fury. "You came back for me," she said, her voice echoing in the still air. A few nights after my visit to Wat Prang Noi, I woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. I couldn't remember my dream, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then I noticed something on my bedside table, a red garland of wedding flowers. I didn't put it there. When I touched it, a flood of images filled my mind. The bride waiting at the temple, her fury when her groom didn't arrive, her death, and then her hand slipping into mine. Her voice echoed in my head, "You came back for me." I realized with horror that she thought I was her groom, returned to finally claim her. And there was nothing I could do to convince her otherwise. The bruises on my wrist burned as I heard her whisper, "It's time for the wedding." I don't know why I'm telling this story. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe I just want someone to believe me. Either way, I can still hear her voice, soft and sweet, calling my name. My name is Mak. Years ago, I left my village to fight in a war that no one remembers anymore. I was young, afraid, but I promised my wife, Nak, that I would return. She was pregnant when I left. I told her to wait for me. The war dragged on longer than I expected. Letters stopped coming. Friends died. I forgot the sound of my own voice. But one thing kept me going, the thought of coming home. When I finally returned, the village felt smaller. The houses were the same, the river still flowed past the temple, but something felt off. People stared at me but said nothing. No one welcomed me back. Nak was waiting at our house. She stood by the door, dressed in white, smiling. She looked exactly the same, beautiful with long black hair and dark eyes. Our son was in her arms, wrapped in a cloth. "You're home," she said, touching my face. Her hands were cold. "I waited for you." I was so happy I didn't question anything. I held her, kissed her, told her I would never leave again. That night we ate together just like before. The house smelled of jasmine, and I felt warm for the first time in years. But the next morning, the unease started. I went to the market, expecting to be greeted, but the vendors turned away. A monk passing by lowered his gaze and whispered a prayer under his breath. My childhood friend, Boon Mi, saw me and ran the other way. I didn't understand. Later, I overheard two old women talking near the river. They spoke in hushed voices. "She won't let him go. He doesn't know yet." That night, I woke up to a sound, a wet, squelching noise. I turned over and saw Nak, sitting on the floor, her back to me. She was holding something in her lap, rocking back and forth. "Nak," I whispered. She didn't answer. When I reached out, my hand brushed against something wet. My fingers came away red. The next morning, I told myself it was a dream, but the house changed. The walls felt damp. Dark stains spread near the ceiling. The air smelled rotten, like meat left out too long. My son never cried, never moved much. He just stared at me, unblinking. One evening, I saw Boon Mi waiting near the rice fields. He gestured for me to come. I hesitated, but something in his face made me go. "You have to leave," he said. "Tonight." "What are you talking about?" His hands shook. "Nak is dead. She died giving birth. We buried her." I laughed. "You're mistaken. I saw her. She's home, waiting for me." Boon Mi's face darkened. "If you don't believe me, watch her when she reaches for something." That night, I sat across from Nak at dinner. She picked up a chili from the plate, stretching her arm further than humanly possible. Her fingers curled unnaturally, bending like reeds in the wind. My heart stopped. I ran, but the house stretched, the door pulling farther and farther away. The walls closed in, the damp wood pressing against me, the smell of decay filling my lungs. I heard Nak's voice behind me, calm, patient. "You promised, Mak." I turned, and she was there, her face inches from mine. Her eyes, hollow and endless, pulled me in. Her smile widened, stretching too far, revealing blackened gums and broken teeth. "You said you'd never leave." My body would not move. The walls pulsed like a beating heart. My legs gave out beneath me. Nak knelt beside me, stroking my hair. "We can be together now." The last thing I saw was my son's face, pressed against my chest, his tiny mouth opening in a silent cry. Then everything went dark. The villagers say our house still stands, untouched. No one dares enter. At night, they hear voices from within, soft and sweet. A husband's voice, a wife's laughter, a baby never crying, a happy family. I was 12 years old when the white elephant statue arrived at the palace. It was a gift from a neighboring kingdom, carved from solid ivory, gleaming like polished bone. The artisans who delivered it claimed it was a sacred offering, an omen of prosperity. My father, the king, was pleased. He ordered it to be placed in the great hall, where its presence dominated the room. Ministers and nobles came to admire it, running their hands over the smooth, intricate carvings. But I hated it from the beginning. There was something about it, something unnatural. The way its hollow eyes seemed to follow me whenever I walked past. The way the ivory felt strangely warm, like skin, when I touched it. I never voiced my feelings. A prince does not question his father's decisions. So, I ignored the unease curling in my stomach and tried to pretend the statue was nothing more than a finely carved ornament. Then the misfortunes began. The first death was dismissed as an accident. One of the palace guards was found at the foot of the grand staircase, his neck twisted at an unnatural angle. No one saw what happened. They said he must have slipped. Then the royal cook fell ill and died within days. A strange sickness, the healers whispered. They had never seen anything like it before. The deaths continued. A scribe was found drowned in the lotus pond, though he had never been known to swim. A servant collapsed in the halls, clutching his throat as if something unseen was strangling him. The court grew uneasy. My father assured everyone that these were unfortunate coincidences. But I saw the way his hands gripped the arms of his throne a little too tightly. And always, standing in the great hall, the white elephant watched. The whispers began soon after. Servants muttered about the statue, saying it was cursed. The ministers avoided walking too close to it, lowering their voices whenever they passed. Even my father, who dismissed all superstitions, became quieter in its presence. One night, I overheard a hushed conversation between two elders in the palace. "The elephant is a bad omen," one of them said. "It was never meant to be given away. The neighboring king sent it as a gift," the other argued. "No," the first man whispered. "He sent it to rid himself of it." I could not sleep that night. I lay awake in my chambers, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the palace. Then I heard it, a low, distant sound, like breathing. I bolted upright, my heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from the great hall, from the statue. By the next morning, I was convinced. The statue had to be removed. I went to my father, expecting him to dismiss my fears. But when I told him what I had heard, he didn't laugh. He only stared at me for a long moment before nodding. That evening, under the cover of darkness, the king ordered the statue to be taken away. A group of palace guards, along with the strongest men in the city, were sent to drag it to an abandoned temple deep in the jungle. I watched as they struggled to move it, the ivory glinting in the torchlight. As they left, I felt the tightness in my chest loosen. It was over, or so I thought. I slept deeply that night, my dreams empty and quiet. When I woke up, the sun was already high in the sky. Everything felt different. The palace was eerily silent. I stepped outside my chambers and looked around. The grand hall stood empty. The familiar tapestries, the golden statues, the intricate lotus carvings. Everything was as it should be. But there was no one there. No guards. No servants. No ministers. No king. I ran through the halls, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every room I entered was empty. The dining hall, the gardens, even the throne room deserted. I rushed to the palace gates and threw them open, and my blood turned to ice. The city was gone. No streets, no markets, no temples, nothing but endless jungle stretching as far as the eye could see. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. This was impossible. The city, the kingdom, had existed for centuries, and now it was nowhere. I turned back to the palace, my heart hammering. And in the great hall, standing exactly where it had always been, the white elephant, back in its place, untouched, as if it had never been moved. I backed away, my mind racing. Then, out of the silence, a single thought came to me. Had the kingdom vanished, or had I